Hi, this is the Baseless Speculation Podcast with Spartacus and Dylan. And our special guest, I'm Mathematician.
Hello.
So today what we're doing is we're going to look at the third and final episode of our Apple Display series. And on this final episode, we're going to look at the rumored 31.6-inch Apple display that was brought to our attention a few months ago in a flurry of rumors. But before we look at those rumors, what we want to do quickly is touch base on historic Apple-related displays and some of the trends there. Apple displays are interesting in that Apple does its own branded displays, and it also does some, I'll call them Apple-endorsed displays that are made by non-Apple entities. When you look at just the Apple-branded displays, you'll notice that they're pretty stagnant as far as maximum display resolution, the highest scaled resolution. They really tapped out since 2004 all the way through about 2016 when the last Apple branded display reached end of life. At that same time, the non-Apple displays from LG came about, and those did see a jump in the highest scaled resolution at the top end with their 5K display. However, that was back in roughly 2016, and those displays are nearing end of life. So it definitely makes sense, just looking at history, that we could see a new Apple display, and it might be actually Apple branded as well. But we also have some rumors to go on with that. I'm Mathematician. Did you want to talk a little bit about the rumor mill?
Sure. In late 2016, Apple announced the LG ultra-fine displays designed for the MacBook Pro with Touch Bar. One of them is 21.5 inches and the other is 27 inches. Early next year, Apple apologized for not updating the Mac Pro for many years and promised a new Mac Pro in the future. And during this discussion, it was revealed that Apple is also planning a new external display for 2019 or later. Then fast forward a couple years, this February, Ming-Chi Kuo claims that Apple will release a 31.6-inch standalone display later this year, and this display is described as 6K 3K. 2 months later, in April, Ming-Chi Kuo claims that this 31.6-inch display has about 500 backlight chips. To quote, will target a very high-end position.
Nope.
Also that month, Apple discontinues the 21.5-inch ultra-fine display. The next month, Mark Gurman of Bloomberg, in an extensive report about the Worldwide Developers Conference in June, also mentions that Apple is working on a new display with HDR support. Also, Guilherme Rambo of 9to5Mac says that this display will also have display P3 wide color support, night shift, true tone, and auto brightness. From these two reports, it's pretty clear that this display will have the features expected from a modern Apple display. Another thing earlier this month was that Apple introduced a 23.7-inch LG ultra-fine display. And this is kind of a strange display because compared to the old 21.5-inch, it's a bit of a side grade because it's a larger display size physically, but it has a lower physical resolution. So the 21.5-inch has a 4096 by 2304 display resolution, but the 23.7-inch has a 3840 by 2160 resolution. However, the maximum scaled resolution is actually higher on the 23.7-inch display. The highest scaled resolution is 3008 by 1692 compared to the 2560 by 1440 of the old 21.5-inch display. So from Ming-Chi Kuo's rumor back in February, the mention of a 6K, 3K display resulted in a good amount of speculation about exactly what resolution that could be. And we have 3 different speculations here. First one is from Katie Marsal of Apple Insider, who speculates 6144 by 3072, which is pretty close to literally 6K, 3K. And the aspect ratio is 2:1. Also, Jeff Benjamin's speculation from 9to5Mac. Also, Jeff Benjamin from 9to5Mac speculates 6400 by 3600, which is the highest scaled resolution of the 27-inch iMac. And same 16:9 aspect ratio. Lastly, there's speculation from Putsy, a commenter on 9to5Mac, who speculated that the display could be 6240 by 2880. And this resolution is the same height as the 27-inch iMac and iMac Pro, because that display is 5120 by 2880, but just with a greater width. And so the aspect ratio is 19.5 to 9. This speculation was referenced by Jeff Benjamin from 9to5Mac in an article. I personally think that Putsy's possibility is the most likely out of those 3 because that resolution keeps the height of an existing Apple display and just increases the resolution in one direction, which is what Apple has done for a number of other new display sizes. But Spartacus and Dylan, what do you guys think?
I certainly would agree that it's very likely that we could just see the Putsy scenario of taking an existing display and just making it wider. We've seen that time and time again in the non-Apple space with ultra-wides. Those have gotten pretty popular over the years. So that makes a lot of sense. I don't think that the 9to5Mac speculation makes a ton of sense. 16:9, it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense for this part of the market, and it really blows the 6K by 3K out of the water with a vertical resolution of over 3600 pixels or over well over 3000 at 3600. So I think that one's probably not going to look too good, and Putsy probably looks pretty good. The one from Katie seems to make a decent amount of sense, but who knows? We'll see. Or Dylan, did you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. Putsy seems like the most accurate one in terms of keeping the height the same and increasing the width. And when you look at what professional market Apple still has, that is the video editing market for sure, and Photoshop market, those kinds of people. And so they want that wider space, especially the video production folks. So moving on, we've kind of plotted these, or iMac's plotted these 3 options in this graph. Sort of the trademark graph of the Apple Display series, but basically we constraint the resolution at a certain point and the PPI at a certain point, and the screen size, because Mark Gurman said, or Ming-Chi Kuo said 31.6, so all those constraints, and we have the 3 different options, or we have a couple different options that make sense within those boundaries. Some of the options that we discussed are actually falling within those boundaries. Specifically, the 6240 by 2880 falls within that boundary, that region. So that seems like, wow, it fits within our constraints that we like to use. And there's another option there, but I think that's more reasoning for this to be the display resolution that we're going to see.
I think the next thing that we wanted to talk about in the context of this particular device, which is a little new in our series, is we don't only want to talk about the external display itself, but because this isn't just a product in a vacuum, it actually has to synergize with some other devices, be it iMacs, be it Mac Pros. And so we think comparisons with other large displays and other things like that make sense in this context.
For this episode, we are going to assume that Putsy's speculation is what's going to happen. This monitor is the highest resolution display that Apple has ever made, and it is designed from the ground up for professionals. It's great for the Mac Pro, and it perfectly extends a 27-inch iMac or an iMac Pro for an immersive multi-monitor experience. It is also Apple's largest ultra-wide display. In fact, compared to the 30-inch Apple Cinema HD display from 2004, the new display is 4% smaller. That's incredible. A 4% smaller area. We think you're gonna love it.
Oh, thank you for that, iMac-matician. That was a pretty good that was a pretty good Apple keynote impression. I think Apple found their new presenter. Jobs was good, and they've done all right since then with a few of the other executives. But I think you've got to step up now and take it from there.
There's a reason he's called iMac-matician.
And speaking in that vein, I think one of the other things that we wanted to talk about was the fact that display diagonals don't always tell the whole story. And so in that, funny little 4% comment, we do have to note that, the area between those displays was a little bit misleading.
Given the wide range of possible aspect ratios in the speculation that we've discussed, I think it's important to consider different aspect ratios, because this means that the size of the display is not well defined just from the diagonal. The area could change by a decent amount depending on the particular aspect ratio that Apple decides to use. And so that's going to be pretty important, I think.
Oh, great. And I think we've got a couple, just to illustrate this, I think we do have a nice illustration of some aspect ratios at scale side by side, and how you can visibly see that the 30-incher does have about the same area as the one of the smaller, the Putsy 31.6-inch display. They're certainly very, very close. So it's a fascinating little thought that as you get really crazy with aspect ratios, then you start to see a little bit of some distortions when we look at just diagonals. The next thing that I think we wanted to talk about was a comparison to other non-Apple displays. In particular, we've got some Asus displays that have local dimming and all that other fun stuff, and they seem to be a pretty fair comparison.
Yeah. So you mentioned that they're comparable. I think they're absolutely not comparable. Reason being is the 32-inch Asus PA32 UCX has far more local dimming zones than this display is rumored to have. So it's clearly going to be a better display in terms of brightness and HDR capabilities, in terms of how many zones can be dimmed and lit, the contrast, etc. It's just going to be a vastly superior display. And as a $2,000 display, it really makes you question how much is this display even going to cost from Apple? Is it going to be, typical Apple pricing? Is it going to be expensive as hell? They're using much older local dimming technology. Their local dimming zones are twice the size of Asus's in their 32-inch display. And so even if it's the Putsy display that we described earlier, which would be the smallest in terms of area, the local dimming zones would still be significantly larger. And I guess this sort of makes sense in some ways. Apple wants to be cheap. Apple wants to have maximum margins. But when you look back at the history of the Apple displays, those were really good values. They were expensive, but they were top of the line tech. And they were cheaper than anything, any other, LG or Dell monitor that had similar specs at the time. And this time around, I don't think Apple's going to even do that. I think, Asus has got them beat on price. There was a lot of FALD monitors shown off at Computex, and those will probably be similarly priced to Asus, if not better. Probably similar though. And Apple won't really have a lot of room for as far as monitors with local array dimming with FALD. I don't think they'll have a lot of room to maneuver to get the margin that they want, but at the same time be actually well positioned.
Yeah, that's some very good points there. And I think this might relate to Apple and the Pro market. So over the past 8 or so years, Apple has made some pretty big missteps and poor decisions regarding Pro software, such as the Final Cut Pro redesign, and hardware, such as the Cylinder Mac Pro. And that's alienated a lot of professional users. Furthermore, the market for a standalone Apple display is small, because most Macs have built-in displays. And also the iMac Pro takes some customers who would otherwise have gone for a Mac Pro. And so maybe Apple doesn't think it's worth making 2 displays, one with 500 local dimming zones and one with 2,000 local dimming zones to get ahead of Asus. And that's why we just see one particular display, at least from the rumors. And I think this also tells us something about the Mac Pro that Apple has promised. So in the past, the Mac Pro and its predecessor, the Power Mac, have had a variety of configurations with a variety of prices, both single and dual processor. But now, due to the iMac Pro and Apple's problems with the Pro market, there's kind of less room for a Tower Mac than there was ever before. The iMac Pro is $5,000 for the base model. And the Mac Pro might be priced even higher than that. And so what if the Mac Pro is sort of similar to this 31.6-inch display in that you have one model that's high-end, but maybe not so high-end, not too high-end. There was supposedly a Geekbench leak for an upcoming Mac Pro with a 28-core Xeon Platinum, Cascade Lake, and 1.5 terabytes of RAM. What if that's the maximum configuration, and the Mac Pro only has single processor options?
They'll definitely stick with single processor, but in terms of Apple and them choosing the correct configuration, I think it's pretty clear they're going to choose some sort of Rome derivative. Maybe it has fewer memory channels, but in terms of timing, Rome is perfect. It's been sampling since the end of last year. They've had silicon back for a while. They've already started shipping to hyperscalers. Apple and AMD have been working together. Apple's even gotten custom GPUs. I see no reason why AMD wouldn't undercut Cascade Lake. They wouldn't. They have a better product. They have a more efficient product, and in a space-constrained environment, a more efficient, better product is going to win.
Oh, I definitely think that in a really design-centric device like a brand new Mac Pro, especially one that started the design cycle, many years ago when Apple posted that infamous mea culpa on their Mac Pro. Something that has been in the cooker for such a long time. Definitely would use a processor that has only been sampling for barely 6 months. That makes sense to me. There's certainly not a lot of momentum behind Apple using Intel processors in their x86 stuff. So yeah, this seems like clearly the time for Apple to switch to a pretty much a brand new architecture from the underdog. I think it's very clear that that's the way that they're going to go forward. And given that,
I guess it would fit true Apple fashion to choose something that's inferior, just because they like to be dumb. But let's move on.
So that's the Mac Pro. This 31.6-inch monitor is likely to be an ultra-wide monitor. Could the iMac and iMac Pro follow suit in the not-so-distant future? For example, the iMac Pro could use the same display, the same 31.6-inch display, and then the successor to the high-end 27-inch iMac could also go in that direction. But I think what might be interesting is the 21.5-inch iMac. If that display goes to this ultra-wide 19.5 to 9 aspect ratio, could we see that kind of could we see an iMac like that in the next 5 or so years? So I have some options here. So what do you guys think? Do any of them look reasonable?
these definitely look reasonable, and it really adds another, feather in the hat of the Putsy recommendation, or speculation rather, that when you just stick to that one dimension and make it a little bit wider, then now it makes a lot of sense to refresh the iMac and go in that direction. And from a sales perspective, now you've got a noticeably different looking display, and it gives you, as Apple, a good excuse to redesign the entire lineup and adopt that aspect ratio or an aspect ratio very similar, and maybe sell some more units. As a result, it makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, I think option 4 definitely makes the most sense to me, but I also think that they would stick and keep a sort of base model garbage, somebody wants to buy a Mac, that's what they're going to buy, and it's overpriced, but it's cheap, right? Relatively. So I think that they would keep that 21.5 inch 1080p iMac and then go along with the other two iMacs being actually good products.
I think they certainly could do that. I'd probably go for option 3. I think option 3 is basically the same thing, but you take that 1080p and switch it over to Retina. And I think that has the benefit of permitting Apple to say that their entire lineup is Retina, and it's a little easier to market, communicate, all that good stuff. But you still have a noticeable difference between some of those displays where the aspect ratio isn't quite as wide as the others. And it's evident, you can just put the displays next to each other and they won't be, they simply won't be as wide. And that, to me, is enough to communicate that that's entry level, and it's not you're not gonna be quite as good, and they can just basically stick a gutted MacBook Air in the back of it and call it a day as their cheap device. So I think they could get away with option 3, but I definitely see where you're coming from, Dylan.
Yeah, I just don't see the cost effectiveness of that, because they want to keep that cost effective model. Like they kept the various laptops, they've kept a really base, low-end model around for way longer than necessary, just so they could keep that, $1,000 or slightly less than $1,000 option. And I think that's what the 21.5-inch iMac is currently, and I think that's what will continue to be. But I guess I could see them making it Retina, as display prices will probably be pretty cheap in early 2020s.
You know what might even be better if they're really looking to bring that bill of materials down, is if they switched over from Intel
to ARM, right?
I no, I think they, all they need to do is put AMD in there. Here's the thing. If it makes sense at the high end,
I don't agree.
then
I don't agree, because in terms of the low-end product, you want an SoC that is cheap and efficient and low power. And I don't see AMD prioritizing that. I don't see them taking that over. What I do see AMD taking over is that ultra high-end, that server product line or, workstation. That's what their entire focus is, and so that's what they're going for. I don't think they'll put an AMD CPU into a low-end.
now, that makes perfect sense. I think AMD is really gonna own the high end. When you want performance, when you want something premium, you think AMD, and then it's gonna be Intel, and then it's gonna be Intel on the low end.
Right, exactly, and same thing with the the GPUs, right, that Apple uses. You think high end, you think performance, you think AMD, right? You don't think NVIDIA.
Absolutely.
In terms of Apple products,
definitely,
at least.
Definitely, that'd be the way to go. I mean, we've seen time and time again, Intel is nothing but entry level. So I think that's clear. We definitely agree on this part of the discussion, and so it's going to be pretty fascinating to see what happens with respect to the iMacs. One of the neat things is that when we kind of graph these guys out over time, similarly to how we have done the external displays, we do notice that the iMacs have stagnated in recent years, since about 2016 or so. And if we took some of the speculation that was discussed on some of the prior exhibits, then we do see that they can keep that upward motion, and that's always going to be good to sell more units, and that's why Apple's around, to sell more units. So we appreciate your guys' time on our Apple Display podcast series, and it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
It's not based on Rome or Cascade Lake. It's based on ARM. Deuces.